Welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast, where we gather workplace learning insights from experts to enable the L&D community to go beyond the traditional. I am Amit Garg, host of this podcast and the founder and CEO of Upside Learning Solutions. This is episode number 15, and today we have two wonderful guests with us to talk about workplace learning in the post-COVID world. Let me briefly introduce our guest to you. Sam Taylor, Jr. is a senior learning specialist with the World Bank Group Open Learning Campus, OLC, the bank group's single destination for staff and client learning. As one of the senior members of the OLC team, Sam works with learning groups across the World Bank Group to design and develop effective and engaging learning solutions. Many of Sam's projects have garnered international recognition, including Brandon Hall and LearnX Awards. Prior to joining the World Bank in 2002, Sam led a multimedia team developing leading-edge online healthcare portals and worked for 10 years supporting the U.S. Department of Defense and branches of the U.S. military to understand and educate military personnel around the world on arms control compliance requirements. Rick Housler, our second guest, is a senior learning specialist at the World Bank Group, supporting the Open Learning Campus, a 2017 winner of the Brandon Hall Award for Digital Platform. He focuses on designing learning interventions that bridge learning theory and technology. Before the World Bank Group, Rick developed learning programs for some of the largest organizations in the healthcare, financial, hospitality, and telecom industries. Sam, Rick, very welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you both join us today.
It's good to be here.
Welcome.
Thank you. So it's a great topic to discuss. We're all in this post-COVID world, and each of us kind of working out solutions in this evolving scenario. So it'll be good to get your insights on what you are seeing and how the World Bank Group is handling what you are learning and how you are adapting to this. So let me start with the first question. Of course, there have been a lot of changes in the last 2 years. If we go back to 2020, when it started, what was the immediate impact at World Bank Group or in general that you saw?
Sure. So, Amit, first off, thank you for inviting us. We appreciate talking with you about some of these topics. And so it's great to be on board here. I think one of the things that happened to us immediately is March 13th, Friday the 13th, 2020, all of a sudden we were told to go work from home. And so there wasn't a choice of like, okay, we could be hybrid or anything. It was just like everybody's going to be working from home until further notice. And I know, like many of us, I thought it was going to be a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks. And so you just never know what to expect. You grab your computer and a few other items and you're out the door. As far as the work program, we had been delivering still a fair amount of our learning face-to-face. And so we had somewhere around 3,000 face-to-face activities and somewhere around 500 that were just pure virtual, and then some that were some combination thereof. And so almost immediately, we couldn't do face-to-face training anymore, which was a significant bulk of the learning that was being delivered. And so we ended up over the course of that year, we ended up doing around 4,000 virtual. So we actually did more virtual sessions and of course, no face-to-face training. And that had some impact on the design of some of the programs, which we can talk about a little bit later.
Wow, that was a big shift. 4,000 virtual sessions in a year.
Yeah, it took us a little while to get there. I mean, like Rick said, everybody went home and, kind of hit, I think most of us mentally kind of hit the pause button. It's like we had things we could keep working on, but we didn't know that we were going to have to fundamentally shift our approach toward learning in general. Mm-hmm. So, I think there was a little bit of a delay in terms of the impact on our learning delivery, certainly. But it pivoted pretty quickly once we realized that this was going to be a longer duration than I think we'd expected.
Yeah. I mean, in spite of a little delay that you can think of now, I think you did pretty well in that transitioning phase. I think a lot of organizations had to just shift from non-digital to digital? And of course, you had experience of both, so it may have made it slightly easier, not easy, but for organizations who were not at all in digital, probably faced a bigger challenge.
I think thankfully for us, we had this open learning campus platform in place, and it was designed to handle, virtual training. And so sort of designed from the bottom up for that. And so I think that really helped.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we had a lot of the architecture in place to do that. But again, and very quickly, I mean, like for example, like onboarding, I mean, you have to deliver that.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, like, it used to be face to face. You're expected, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, on Wednesday we still have to deliver these sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think initially they just delivered them the way they had been delivering them, And I think over time you start to look at those and go, now wait a second, if everybody isn't here in person, and people started complaining about just fatigue of being online. And if you're sitting in a room, you can get up and take breaks and do different things. But, if you're sitting in sessions, you just can't run those for like 6 or 7 hours straight. Just people. And one of the things that happened in the onboarding is several years ago, we implemented a feedback mechanism. So we literally had, iPads or computers or phones where people could give input immediately to different sessions, which is a little bit intimidating when you're samurai that's presenting. People are judging you like right after you're done. But what happens out of that is you get this immediate feedback from people. And I think this feedback mechanism can feed right in. And so immediately they're getting feedback for the onboarding program saying, it doesn't make sense for you now to do 6-hour-long or 7-hour-long sessions. It's just overload. And then so immediately it's like, why don't we stretch that out over 3 days or 4 days and do 2-hour sessions or 3-hour sessions? And so I think that over the course of that first year, it was recognized and then designed, redesigned in that way. And a lot of the other programs had to pivot like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that was probably the most dramatic difference, is that the pandemic changed the language around learning delivery, and it changed the mechanisms and the design approach to the delivery as well. Because, the language up to that point is that we heard from a lot of our learning teams was, well, we have to have a meeting, we have to be in person so we can do these exercises or, see each other and work together in teams and that sort of thing. And, when those were no longer an option, you either shut down, which teams didn't want to do and couldn't do, or you rethought the paradigm. And so, it forced people into a mindset of, okay, well, we can't keep people in a classroom or a conference room for 5 days in a row for 8 hours for our kind of traditional major workshop design. How are we going to redo it? And so as Rick was saying, you broke it up and you stretched it out. So it was not 8 hours a day. It was maybe 4 hours, and it was once a week and over, 5 weeks. But it forced teams to rethink the way that they were doing things, and it forced them to get more comfortable with the technology too. Everybody was used to WebEx, but more from a participation standpoint than using it as a primary delivery model. So they had to kind of get used to the technology and see what it would allow them to do, and then use those parameters in the design of their exercises.
I think also, a lot of the design was the people in the room first, and then maybe there was a WebEx component where people were hooked in. So the design was still very much focused on the people in the room, and so you would hear these comments or complaints from people that were, coming in that were virtual to say, hey, what about us? And so they were, I wouldn't say, dismissively, but they were, it was kind of a secondary audience, you could say. And I think now they're the primary, they're the only audience, right? They're the primary audience and the only audience. So you don't have any choice. Yeah. And I think that then if you're getting good feedback on these programs, you begin to tweak a little bit. You begin to say, okay, how can we do this? And you saw a lot of experimentation with polling online or with just breakout groups and just different mechanisms that the platforms had in order to to try to get that level of interactivity you were getting face to face in a virtual environment.
Excellent. Excellent. The 4-hour thing over 5 weeks is very interesting, and we'll come back to that. But just a quick follow-up question. Of course, what I heard was before the pandemic, your trainers were used to, catering to the in-person audience more, and if at all somebody was online, so you had a hybrid model even before pandemic. So some people could join it online.
Kind of. I mean, it's funny because even in the nomenclature we use to describe the learning activities. So when we create learning activities in our open learning campus, we have to define delivery type. So, there was either face-to-face, self-paced, virtual, but to kind of give you a sense of the mindset, one of the common delivery types was face-to-face plus virtual. And as Rick was saying, that really meant that we're teaching the class in a classroom, but hey, if you want to click on this link and watch, that's great. But it wasn't like they were actively engaged in the work, in the actual workshop. It was kind of a passive participation. They clearly, acknowledged them and tried to engage them as part of the conversation, but it was very much what's happening in front of you. And then if people were online listening in and maybe sending something in chat, that was great. But as Rick said, that mindset is completely shifted at this point.
Yeah. Very interesting, because the way I see it is for people who shifted to virtual, and now that the organizations are coming back to office in some form, and possibly it will be hybrid for everyone. So you will end up having hybrid training sessions, some people in classroom and some people in a virtual session. So great that you already had some sort of a mix, even though, and not entirely intentional that way, or having equal focus on both sets of audiences, but still that experience would be valuable as you shift to a proper hybrid going forward, as the work itself becomes more hybrid.
I think we had, we have a lot of staff. So there's another exercise that's happening as well, decentralization. So you have a lot of staff that are working in other offices, all around the world. And so we were evolving to support that, as it were. And then I think this just forced the issue a little bit. Sort of set, all those plans you had of slowly evolving and going in that direction, all of a sudden now we're going to have to fast track all of that. So I think that's, because we have offices, 140 something offices all around the world where people are working, and more and more people are being hired and working out at different country offices. And so we were having to support that as it is, but it also sort of leveled the playing field. So your participation might have felt like it wasn't as good if you weren't in person, but now when everybody is virtual, it definitely, you get the same experience across wherever you are in the world. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sam, go ahead.
No, you said a lot of what I was thinking as well. And I think that it's the biggest challenge I think that we saw in the pandemic delivery of learning programs, and I think it's something that's going to continue for quite a while after, we do start to come back to the office, is that you lose that physical presence component. If you're an instructor, you can read the room when you're giving a presentation. You can see when people are engaged, when they're drifting off, and, the participation of the people in the room is more active when they're sitting there. They're not off surfing another website, or they're not ordering something on Amazon while you're trying, sitting in the class. At least you hope they're not, but at least you can see when they're doing it. So that's probably, that dynamic is not going to change, because as Rick said, we're going to go back to a hybrid model. We're already kind of in a hybrid model now. We're slowly opening things back up again. In some countries, they are, almost back to full time. But I think for a long time, the physical constraints on the conference rooms for pandemic conditions are there. So, what used to hold 30 people now may only hold 15. And there are physical separations and barriers and things like that you have to work around. And you're going to have a mix of people that are online in the classroom. And so there's going to be another natural period, I think, as we start to go back to the more fully hybrid model, where we're going to have to get used to resisting the urge to focus on what's immediately in front of you and still catering to, or, acknowledging the external component or the virtual component of our participants as well. So it's going to take another kind of evolution of the skill set of our instructors to kind of get used to that and to not fall back into old habits.
True. Yeah, so I think Rick used this term called room first. So maybe we've gone from room first to virtual only, and we'll probably come to balanced for room as well as virtual at some stage.
Yeah, I think so. Every program is going to be a little bit different, I suspect, and every person will deliver differently. But you're right. There's definitely going to be much more of a focus on the virtual component of it. Mm-hmm. And I think, to me, in my mind, when I would advise most groups, I would say to design virtual, and then if you have people in the room, then at least for the next year, while we're doing whatever it is we're going to be doing. Are we coming back to the office? Are we not? Are we 2 days a week? Are we 3 days a week? I mean, all those things are being tested out. And some offices, for the job that they're doing, they need to be in the office to be able to meet with counterparts. And so that's part of their job. They have to do that. And so they're going to be in the office doing that. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be a mixed bag, and it's going to be dependent on, who the audience is and kind of what you're trying to train them.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked about, I think Sam mentioned that the trainers were, of course, they could read the room so much more easily. They could sense if the audience is with them, etc. And they can moderate the session accordingly. They can change their speed, they can give more examples, etc. So did you have to give any specific, training to the trainers to be able to do it better in the virtual world? Because it would have been a new thing for them also.
I mean, there are some groups that did set up some training programs for their instructors, and there were groups that were doing more clinic type deliveries anyway. So our operations group, I know, for example, did they did some preparatory work for their people that were giving regular clinic presentations to kind of give them some guidance. But for us on our side, what we did was on the Open Learning Campus, we built an entire section full of resources around virtual learning and virtual delivery to serve as a reference set for people that we could direct them to and say, if you know nothing about the design of virtual training programs, here's basically a website on the Open Learning Campus that you can go to that's got best practice, some exercises, some tip sheets, things like that allowed us to kind of stretch our ability to work with other teams to help give them some advice.
Okay. Also, from a learner perspective, have you had an opportunity to gather feedback from these virtual sessions and possibly compare it with your earlier structure? So pre-COVID and post-COVID, has there been anything that you've been able to gather based on how the experience has been for learners?
I would say overall, yes, we gather feedback on the delivery of different courses. And when you look at sort of the macro, the whole organization, the quality actually went up, the ratings. So now, individual sessions, no doubt there were some that were perhaps lower before, so it's going to be uneven across an organization as large as ours. But at a macro level, they were actually, up a little bit. And so now, you wonder why. We haven't really done much of a deep dive into why that is, but I could speculate a little bit. I think I think it's a little bit more focused, perhaps to virtual, and the fact that some programs that may have been running for some time now were looked at a little bit closer and were maybe examined as part of this. Now, I'm not saying they were all completely redesigned, but I think people had to be a little bit more careful and a little more aware of what they were doing, perhaps. And so the ratings were actually slightly higher.
Very interesting. And if you have, tried to see the trend, has the trend continued to be higher than pre-COVID ratings on a macro line, or is it improving from early days to now, or stable? Is it declining? Also just trying to get into whether it was the early days that resulted in, very high or positive feedback, and maybe it has dipped after that, or it has continued to rise.
I think it's my guess is that it's stabilized. I think there were. I think it kind of depends on the cycle of where we started. Where we started doing the analysis, and so there was a period of time, March 13th, Friday 13th, until the end of the fiscal year, which is the end of June. So that would have been, sort of the end of the third and the fourth quarter for us. So really, the comparisons I'm drawing is, maybe a little bit of that, and then comparing it to the next full cycle, full year, starting from then on. So I haven't done that level of analysis to say, okay, on March 13th, what were the ratings for the last quarter versus the fourth quarter or something like that. It's really more of than comparing across from year to year. But yeah, I think the ratings I'm talking about, the improvement was from the first year, and then after that, from what I have seen, they've sort of stabilized there. There hasn't been like a continual improvement up. So, but they were never really that low relative, and so it wasn't like we were going from like 3s to 7s or something like that. It was more like 6.1 to 6.2.5 or something like that. So it was this incremental improvement. It wasn't like a big jump.
I mean, it's one of those things that those of us that are kind of in the learning space would love to kind of get that data, directly from participants and design a survey to say, okay, what was it that worked better for you? What didn't work well? So that we could kind of carry that forward. But we have a hard time kind of getting that kind of level of data that makes kind of resistant to doing surveys, wide surveys like that in general. But I suspect that a lot of it was that people felt that it was easier to participate in the learning because they didn't have to go anywhere. All they had to do was just hit a link and they were in. So I think that there was kind of a reduction in the barriers to learning. So that probably affected some people's opinion of what the quality. And I think that, we grew tolerant of, some training programs too, that we could, you knew that everybody was working within the same limitations. So, connectivity and that sort of thing. Everybody got used to the first 5 minutes. First of all, punctuality to training sessions definitely went up, which was a shock because you didn't have to stall for people to make it to the building that the training was being given in. But, it's like, then you had to, a few minutes of getting used to, can you hear me? Can you see my screen? But once you got over those initial, technical hurdles, the training went pretty smoothly. So I think people started to kind of get that feeling and buy into the models and the approaches.
I'm sure even the fact that you redesigned some of the programs instead of having them 6 to 7 days or long days, spacing it out 4 hours in a week over a few weeks every week. So that also could have impacted the way they felt about the training. It was possibly not such an overload, or it gave them time to reflect on it. Would that also have impacted their ratings?
I would think so. I mean, it certainly gave you the space to say, okay, we're going to present some core concepts in these 3 hours, and then here's some things for you to kind of work on in the interim, and then we'll come back, next week, and we'll talk about what you've, thought about or what you've decided, what you've come to understand. And so it gave you that spaced learning opportunity, as opposed to, if you could only get people in a room for 8 hours, you just threw everything at them and hoped whatever you had stuck. But given that we could space things out over time now, I think it did give some improvements to the quality of the delivery, and also from the learner's perspective, an opportunity to reflect and synthesize and, process and take some of the concepts in a little more deeply than they would have had it just been in one day in one classroom.
The accessibility also, there can't be overstated, I suppose, is that once if they were all face to face, there were, I would say, none of those sessions were really being recorded or tracked for later, And so one of the aspects of the virtual is it's so much easier to just record that session. And so even if you register for the session and for whatever reason you had to step out or you missed a part of it, we have noticed there's a lot, I wouldn't say all, but there's a lot of sessions that are recorded now that you can go back and watch. And so you can, in some cases, you can then send the link out. Hey, I know you missed the session. Here's something. So that covered more of the time zones as well on the accessibility part. And so it really was you weren't there live to be able to ask your question, but you could watch the same presentation that was given, and you could see other people's questions and you could see the replies to those, which often might cover your understanding. So I think that the recording of sessions also helped.
And I would suspect that, not just the people who could not make those sessions or were in a different time zone, but even the people who attended the live sessions would have gone back to the recordings just to refresh, because if it is a long training, you practically can't retain everything. So I don't know if you've seen that as a trend, but I would suspect that would have also happened.
I don't think we've got the metrics to know for sure. I suspect that you're right. I mean, I know I've gone back and looked at things, in meetings or programs that I participated in, to go back and watch something to kind of refresh my memory of what was discussed. So, it's one of those areas where if we had more time and resources, we probably would do a better job of chunking the sessions so that you could get directly, or, finding ways to let people dive into direct concepts. So if it was kind of a 4-hour session, you didn't have to, scroll through to try to find the one section you were looking at. Maybe it was indexed that you could find it. But maybe that's something we look at as we start to improve the Open Learning Campus platform and work with teams now, because as we said, I think we're going to be dealing with a lot of the same limitations going forward for the next year or so. So we, take advantage of the fact that we'll have some time to play with new ideas and grow on what we've learned.
Yeah.
I think there also has been, more requests to build self-paced modules.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got, you have these sessions that are recorded. And I remember talking to someone even yesterday. It was like sort of, they were asking me like, okay, what do I do after this if I want to make it self-paced? And it's kind of like this, there's this, this continuum or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, well, we can start with the most basic thing, and we can say, there's a session, here's a recording of it. You send them the recording. Okay. Then there's, the little baby step is like, okay, maybe you edit that. You edit it a little bit. You edit out the first, 3 minutes. Maybe there's some questions in the middle that took too long, and then there's some stuff at the end that nobody really needs. So you do like a little bit of editing and you shorten it down, and then maybe you can take an hour session down to 40 minutes or something if you do just a little bit of that. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, I want to take that, and I'd like to just take those slides and maybe ask a few questions, but I don't want to necessarily script the whole thing out. And the person who is speaking may be doing a better job than I am right now, but we do have some speakers that are really good. And so we had some programs where we were just really literally cutting their live audio. Like, we're not in the recording studio with them after the fact, but they did the session live, and they were so good that you could just cut the segments, line them up with the slides, and then to add some questions in there. And you could see how this sliding over here a little bit more complicated, right? And so then we have some courses that are delivered like that, that then can be prerequisites perhaps for something else. And then you sort of keep evolving until you're in a full-blown self-paced design, And so, and it kind of depends. Sam and I spend a lot of time with clients talking about making self-paced learning and trying to decide with them, who's the audience for this. And not that we don't all want to do the very best work that we can, but if you're producing a program that's going to be taken by 35,000 people or 100,000 people or 200,000 people, that needs to be at a higher level of fidelity than something that is going to be taken by a couple hundred. And so you've got to do kind of this ROI calculation and say, what are we doing here? I remember, I'll tell you a quick story. I worked on a program a couple of years ago, and it was fairly expensive to build. And then when I was looking at the ROI numbers after a couple of years that had been rolled out, I looked at those numbers, and the participation numbers, completion numbers were actually very low. And I was a little bit embarrassed, like, oh my God, this is my program. I spent all this time and energy on it. It's beautiful. Like from what I'm looking at from my matrix, the impact was really low. So I was like, God, did we waste our time here, So I had a coffee with the person, the contact owner from that project. And I said, from my perspective and looking at the completion numbers and everything, now the survey, everybody loves it, but it's like really low numbers. And she said very kindly, she said, look, Rick, we're dealing with $100 million projects that we're training people how to do. So if I can train 3 or 4 or 5 people really well on how to do one of these projects that's going to be 200 million people and have this level of impact on people on the ground, this is a no-brainer, easy. ROI's through the roof for this thing. And so that changed my perspective a little bit on what KPIs or matrix we were using. And on some programs, reaching the right people, even if they're a small number, can have a huge developmental impact. And so I just throw that into the mix a little bit.
Yeah, very interesting. Absolutely. Sometimes it may not be, for the masses, it's for those critical people, and their work is really impactful. It's like touching so many lives and making such a big impact. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. You talked about, some of the learning design evolution, in your previous comments. So is there anything that stands out in your view, apart from breaking those courses into smaller bits and spacing them out? And also, I think you talked about, you used breakout rooms, etc. Are there other examples of anything that would have evolved in your learning design, picking from the experiences in the post-COVID world?
I know that there are conversations that I've had with teams that I've worked with in the past, pre-pandemic, around the idea of thinking about your content in not just a single delivery, but are there pieces of it that can have a life of their own and be used in other ways to kind of extend the reach of your learning program? And that was a nice thing to think about pre-pandemic. I think during the pandemic, and certainly I think going forward, groups understand it more because they see the value of that ongoing presence with their learning material beyond just the single delivery. And whether it's a virtual face-to-face class or if it's a self-paced learning program, the teams that I'm working with are more open to discussing, okay, well, what are the core pieces that maybe we could pull out and make available as, just an informational video that we put into the Open Learning Campus that might, allow somebody to go back and look at the material later on in an easy way, or that might raise awareness around this and then they want to go take the course that you've developed. So it's kind of a bi-directional feed. It was easier to have those conversations and get buy-in from some of the teams to think in that manner and actually do some of that. And I think too, one of the conversations that we're hearing is being more respectful of people's time in terms of learning. It was kind of easy to say, oh, I'm going to give a 4-hour, workshop and here's the date and you should come. Now it's, that you've got to get people's attention and get things done in a short period of time. So I think that, designing stuff so that it's more accessible and more digestible is something that'll have a long-term impact in our design approach as we go forward.
We had initially when the OLC was conceived, we had sort of this academy where courses were delivered and communities of practice. And then we also had bite-sized. So I think from the beginning, we had that mechanism in place, but I would say that it was underutilized, at least on the staff side. And so I think that there are more and more programs now that are wanting to provide just-in-time, bite-sized learning for people. And so I think that we were moving in that direction already, and we're expanding, doing some improvements to the system over the next year that'll greatly expand that, the ability to do that. But it's not just taking the technology and saying, okay, now let's use it, right? It's like you have to have a business driver or a rationale behind that. And I think that through COVID and working from home, it's made it much more aware that that's the direction we should go. And like Sam was saying, we're getting comments from people now or questions saying, hey, we want to communicate or send the smaller piece of information out. How can we do that? How can we track it? How can we know, And so I think that where we saw sort of the vision architecture-wise from the systems to support that, we weren't really getting buy-in from people that they wanted to do that or they're aware of doing it. And now the conversation has really come front and center. And it's a big part of the OLC 2.0, where, the improvements that we're working on now, a big part of that is supporting this area, that there's going to be more and more content, we believe, delivered in that way. And it's coming from people, with the idea. Now, they don't come to us. They don't know our language, right? So they don't come to us and say, I'd like to have bite-sized learning. They don't know they have no idea what you're talking, right? That's not the way they approach us. Yeah. They come to us and they say, how can we reach people? I've got this little bit here. I'd like for them just to be able to see that part without taking a whole course. How can they get into the content quicker? So these are the type of questions that we might pose. And now we're moving in the direction to be able to support that need better.
Maybe they'll come and say, I want them to see just this much.
We hear from the learners. They're the ones that say, I don't want to sit through a 4-hour course if all I need to know is how to build a pivot table or something like that. I always pick on pivot tables because it took me years to figure them out. But yeah, so as Rick was saying, with the work we're doing toward the OLC 2.0, for what we're calling it for right now anyway, it varies, very specific and very intentional around just-in-time learning, in the flow of work learning, and it's to reflect the need of our staff to really say, I don't want to go take a class on X. I just need to know how to process this one form, or what are the questions I should be asking around this. And so a lot of what we're going to be working toward in the next year is building a platform and integrating a platform that will allow us to do that, to really get just the information that people need so that they can be effective. And then if it encourages them to go take courses on it later on, that's great. But I think it's interesting. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day that workplace learning is different from academic learning, because in academic learning, you're really trying to almost master a subject. You're trying to figure out biology, or you're taking chemistry or something like that. You're really trying to focus on a larger area. Workplace learning is all about effectiveness. It's like how, and you see it a lot in the literature on how quickly can we get people up to speed so that they're able to do their job and perform on the job. And so the learning's got to adapt to that mentality. So it's not the 4 or 5 hour, workshops. It's the 15-minute video that shows you how to do something. We're in a lot of ways, we're borrowing from the way our kids learn. My son didn't take a class to figure out how to tie a tie. He watched a video on YouTube and, worked it out. So that mindset started to trickle over into the workplace model as well. And so we've got to have the platform and the methodologies in place to support that.
I think also it's a bit of a shame, but we spend so much time and energy creating these self-paced courses that have really brilliant explanations in them, and they have content contained within them. And then you have people that take them and they complete them, and then they never go back and look at them again. So you've got all this, time and effort that went into, presenting a concept or explaining an idea, and this sort of, underutilized. So I think also there's an opportunity to pull some of those pieces out, and instead of burying them inside of a learning program, people should be able to go back to them and review them. I've got a project now I'm working on that's sort of virtual onboarding, and it's the same thing. It's like I'm looking through this and I'm thinking, I have never heard this described as well as I'm seeing it right here. If I had, I think this should be like a marketing thing. So it should, yes, it was created for this self-paced learning program, but we should be able to pull that piece out and make that available easily for people that want to go back and review it. Particularly, we don't memorize things much anymore. It used to be, I remember you could remember like your 7-digit phone number from where you grew up, right? People used to memorize things and they would just have them. Nobody memorized. I don't even know my mother's number anymore. I don't even know if you said, okay, here's a phone, call your mother. I'd be like, I have no idea how to do that. Right. But I used to, right? I used to always remember that. So now you can just Google, or, you just say, literally, I just say, call mom, and it calls her, And so I'm not having to remember that level of specificity. So I think now easier access to content pieces is definitely part of the thinking as well. And, it's quite an easy thing to say, and, a more difficult thing to implement and try to roll out, and also to explain to clients, like, here's the reasons why we may want to chunk the content in a certain way, because then we can pull those pieces out later and reuse them, and you get, basically more bang for your buck as well, right? So,
yeah.
Well, it changes too, because you don't want to force somebody to enroll in a workshop or an online course if all they're trying to do is one little small task. That's a waste of their time and a waste of, frankly, resources as well. And so I think that, the thinking that has gone into the OLC 2.0 project has been around, how do we get the information to people quickly? And so it's, and in the flow of what they're doing, it's not, I need to go to the Open Learning Campus and sign up for this course and, learn so I get my certificate so that I could, do the one little thing over here that I needed to do. They just need a pointer to, if they're in a Word document or something like that, or a browser, maybe there's a link back to the OLC that says, hey, here's some videos on what it seems like you're looking for, maybe you want to look at. And so it can kind of build those connections and, again, help people be effective quickly.
Lots of great points there. What I see from the responses that you just gave, there is the most beautiful statement that you made was, there is an increased respect for learners' time, and that is possibly an overarching theme that we are seeing, whether it is, micro learning or, just in time, what you were just mentioning about, hey, you are probably doing this and this may help. So context sensitive learning, all of these are really trying to support the learner and also being very conscious of, of their time. So these are great practices, and I'm so happy to hear that, they are evolving and they're coming in. I'm sure it'll make learning more enjoyable and more effective at Worldwide Group.
Could be. I mean, one thing too that just struck me is that the technology has evolved to the point where we can recognize what people are doing as learning. So, the metrics around learning for so long have been predicated upon completion reports. And, how many people took my class, how many people completed it? And, the trying to get down to, are they more effective in doing something is hard to do. It's that, the level 3, level 4 type evaluation stuff that take time and resources to do well. And so people were using completions as a proxy for effectiveness. If they took this class, then we're just assuming that they're better at it than they would have been had they not taken this class. but with the technology and the ability to track through learning experience platforms what people are watching, what they're doing, that it can add up to a kind of a more holistic approach to their learning portfolio. That it's not as dependent, because that was the conversation that we had with a lot of people when they started, trying to talk them into micro learning and bite-sized learning, is like, well, can I tell how many people used it? It's like, well, we can give you basic metrics of how many people watched it, but we can't really tell you who it was and how long they spent. But the platforms are evolving so that we can start to get at those answers as well. But, and from a learner's perspective, it's kind of like they want credit for what they're doing. In some cases, sometimes they just want to get something done. But like I said, the technology is evolving to the point where we can have those conversations around making content more specific and shorter duration and very targeted, and still have it count towards something.
All right. So, I see, maybe micro, spaced out, shorter form, just in time, and a blend are probably the overriding themes, and also the hybrid, which could be a hybrid workshop, which could be in person as well as virtual. Any other trends that you are observing, in the L&D space in this post-pandemic world?
Uh-oh.
No, I guess I'll say a word about skills and competencies, since that's everybody's. What we have seen, at least in our organization, it's hard to do, and it takes a lot of effort. And so we have tried to do skills and competencies, and we can try to define what that means for us. And it runs about every, I'd say, a 6-year cycle. And so I remember when I first arrived, they were just starting to talk about it. It was sort of gaining ground again. And then I was like, well, what do we know about competencies? And then somebody dragged me all over to their office, and they said on their bookshelf, they had a whole row of binders mapping out all the competencies. And I was like, man, that looks like a lot of work. I'm like, yes, it was a lot of work. And it's, and I don't know how much it was really, applied. And then it came around, and I was involved in a little bit, and then that sort of died off. And so they had remapped competencies and redid a bunch of skills and everything for different jobs and different roles. And then that team, was sort of disbanded, like, we don't need you anymore. And it sort of fell out of favor. So again, it's like the cycle, like the 6 or 7 year cycle where it comes in and out of vogue. And so I think one of the questions is like, why? Like, what, as Sam would always say, like, what is this trying to accomplish? What's the point? What are we doing? Why are we doing this? And I think it was this idea of trying to skill people to be able to do a certain role. And so then if you can define what those skills are, then you can do those roles. So right now they're trying to do more staff rotations, where they have people working in different regions, different parts of the world. So if you're top down, it would be very helpful for you to be able to see, a full matrix and say, I need, a water specialist at this grade level that would be an expert that's worked in some of the other regions, and I could have them work in this other region, And so to be able to sort of map what their skills were directly versus just knowing them, right? And so it's always been a very personal, like, oh, I know someone, then you can call them. But what happens if the best person you actually don't know, you never met them? You wouldn't even know that they existed, right? If you didn't have some system tracking that. So I think it was a mechanism to try to sort of systematize and put it in a place where you could then do that. So top down, I can sort of understand the rationale. Bottom up, if you're a staff member, then maybe this is a way for you to hone up your skills, make them visible, so that then you can use those to network and move around and get different jobs. And so, but it got so complicated with the skills. We're dealing with people. If they come to me and we say, okay, here we're going to define these skills, and they have to take these courses to get these skills, immediately where they're going to get rejected because they're going to say, Rick, I have a PhD in this subject. What makes you think taking your course means all of a sudden that my skill is at the right level? Like, I can teach this course. Like, why are you making me take this? why are you making me take your flimsy little e-learning course to prove this? So then so you get into kind of these discussions around whether the competencies are mapped properly or not. So all of that to say, I see that coming sort of back into vogue now, and I've been involved in it now on 2 of its rotations. And so now I'm really curious to see, what's the new thinking around it and how do they think they're going to utilize it? Otherwise, it's going to there'll be some remnants of it. And maybe that's the best we can do. Some pieces of it that we're actually utilizing that makes sense for us. And then the other stuff is maybe we're just, we evolve out of it. But anyway, so that's one of the trends that's back in vogue at the moment. And we'll see whether it sticks this time or not.
Very interesting. And I would believe that over a period of time, the cycle needs to be repeated because things change and different people join. And so the, matching may get distorted, etc. But, I personally see how organizations really use this is one to have good conversations with people so you can plan their careers, based on actual skills. You can look at individual gaps, which is again for those conversations, but also aggregate gaps, which can help you see where we are going and what we could be missing in terms of skills. So whether we train en masse for those skills or we hire people, whatever. And it could also be, something which tells a future direction for the organization also. So today we are here, and if we want to go in 2 years' time, this is the skill that we need to increase. So let's say data analytics. If it's not a skill today, which is in abundance, you may need it 2 years down the line, and an organization can plan accordingly once you have mapped people to that skill matrix. So yeah, brilliant thing. I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned that the cycle is coming back.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how much traction it gets this time around. Again, I think there's definitely a lot of conversations happening around it, and I think people, at least for the conversations I've been part of, I think people are a little more open to what it might mean in terms of implementation and particular use. And Rick's right. I think one of the rotation piece and also the conversations we have with staff during onboarding about you need to think about your career as being more horizontal, not so vertical. I mean, you may have been hired to be a water specialist because that's your area of expertise, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't broaden your capabilities and your understanding of the work that the bank is doing so that you're able to kind of support other parts of the business, maybe in other areas. Maybe you're a water specialist, but you also happen to be a fantastic project manager. Well, maybe you can take those skills and help somebody run their project that's not a water project, but, share your expertise and your experience in that area. And, the skills and skill mapping would allow us to recognize and value those capabilities as well. So it's, as Rick said, it's not so much the personal understanding or the personal knowledge of somebody's capabilities. There's some tangible, metrics that you could look at and use in finding people, and to also help people find other people. So if I need to, if I want to find out about water policy or something like that, I could find people based on those skill sets and ask questions of them.
Locating expertise is obviously another area that skills mapping could help with. Very interesting.
And the learning part, that's where sort of we fit in more is if these skills can be mapped and there are programs associated with those that then we could either define or that exist or could be built that then help to upskill people in these areas. I think that there's some usage there. I mean, there's some uses there, and we'll see how it evolves. We're in the conversations now. It's sort of in that ramp up period where a lot of people are talking about it right now, and then I think it's partly driven by hiring people and then rotating people, and then when you start to have those conversations around boards and people talking about that, then I think that the skills are a natural part of that conversation to determine. And like you said, things are changing. A lot of jobs are changing as well, and expertise you may have when you were hired you're going to have to continue to evolve that in different areas. I was listening to a guy this morning about just monitoring and evaluation, just as a conversation, right? Monitoring and evaluation has evolved. There's when you may have gotten your, PhD in it, 10 years ago, there's a lot of new methodologies that are out there now, picking KPIs and things like that. And so somebody coming right out of school may know things that you don't know. However, those new people are not going to know the organization. They're not going to know probably don't have the people skills, or you're not going to know, the networking part. And so you've got to always have a combination of fresh technical skills, but then also all the other skills it's going to take for you to be successful.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point, because, almost all domains are evolving and new things keep coming. So if we have had some education or PhDs, as you said, many years ago, possibly the world has changed a little bit. So we may need to upskill a little bit, brush up, or just learn some new additional stuff while we know most of the basics already.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think back to early on in my career before the bank, and I remember a conversation I had with one of my managers around not necessarily training, but it was around skill sets and capabilities and that sort of thing. And I remember the conversation being very pointed and basically saying, well, if we need that, we'll just go out and hire it. It's not like we're going to develop it internally. We'll just go out and find it in the open marketplace. And I think maybe that's another impact of the pandemic, is that the marketplace has changed. We all heard about the Great Resignation. I don't think we've really seen it at the bank per se. But it's hard to say because we haven't seen anybody in 2 years. They may have left and we just don't know it. But, I think that there is an openness to, if you have the time to develop the skills among the people that you have, there's an advantage to doing that. Because as Rick said, they'll know the organization, they know the language and the culture of the people that work around them. And that's a huge part of the equation for us, because, particularly in our operational staff and our technical staff that are out in the field working on projects, their ability to understand the client's needs, the ability to carry out these massively complex projects and communicate their needs and their requirements back to, the powers that be, is critical. You're not going to hire somebody straight out of a PhD program and sit them across from a finance minister in another country and expect them to negotiate a $100 million contract. It's just not in their skill set. You need somebody that's been there and seen it done to kind of understand how to frame those conversations and to define the project parameters and that sort of thing. So I think, but as Rick said, it does start with skills. You've got to understand, well, what skill sets do we need? What do we have the time to develop? How do we develop them? And staff have to also see the buy-in for them. We always talk about the "what's in it for me" syndrome. But if they see some value in spending the time to develop skills that may be outside of what they're, typically worried about, I think people start to buy into it. And once you get the buy-in from the rank and file, then, it's not a top-down imposition. There's value in it for staff as well. And so they're more amenable to, it's not so much as Rick said, the getting past well, I've got a PhD in this from Oxford. Why are you even bothering me? Of course I'm an expert. It's like, okay, well, you're definitely really smart and you're really good, but there are other things that you need to know as well.
Very interesting. Absolutely. That's a great area in terms of, new development. And I'm sure it's not unique to just the World Bank Group. I'm sure it's happening, especially after this 2-year period. Maybe a lot of organizations are re-looking at this. So thanks for bringing that up. But we can't really end this without asking you this one, which is what remains the same after the pandemic? Of course, we talk about what is changing, what are new trends, but in our view, what is going to remain the same?
I think, so at least near term, the hybrid model is going to remain the same. Mm-hmm. We're not, like we talked about earlier, the physical changes to the work environment and just the dynamics of who's in the office, who's not in the office. And even if we're back fully on premises, I think that it's going to take a while to frankly, learn how to work with people again. There's been this distance component that we've gotten used to over the past 2 years. Rick and I have worked together literally side by side for the last 12, 13 years. And yet now we see each other once every 4 months or so. Now we talk all the time, but, it's not like we were having lunch every single day. I mean, our wives joke that, we see more of each other than they do. So, but that allowed us to really carry out our work, was that, ability to meet at lunch and talk about our projects so that we could backfill for either one of us if we were out. So I think that, that the hybrid mindset is going to continue for a while. And I think and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's probably a bonus from having done this, beyond just changing the language around learning. That stuff that we said absolutely couldn't be done has now been demonstrably proven to be done, doable. So, I think that recognition and that willingness to think outside of traditional models is something that will carry on beyond the pandemic and beyond getting back to the office.
I think, the learning, any learning interventions that we design or are a part of designing have just got to be good. They've got to, the standard on those has continually been raised. I remember we first started producing e-learning. Everybody was like, well, why are you doing self-paced learning? Like, I can't learn anything unless there's somebody, the experts in front of me, teaching me about it, telling me that I can ask some questions, Now, after they started taking it and sort of evolving over these years, if they go to a session and there's somebody presenting with a PowerPoint slide, they just start commenting like crazy, and we hear about it, So they're like, why didn't you just send this ahead of time as like a little e-learning so I could take it? Like, why? So the model over sort of slowly over the last 5-8 years has been, if it's a presentation or if it's like they've gotten used to taking these little e-learning modules or bite-sized pieces, and they're like, you should send that ahead of time, then we can look at that and think through it a little bit. Then when we go virtual live, then we can ask questions of the expert and have a conversation. And so the expectation of these people designing their learning programs has changed, pretty dramatically. And now the expectation is like, why am I just sitting here watching the presentation? That's the feedback we get. I should get that ahead of time so I can watch a little bit of it at a time. So I think that designing good learning experience has always been important and will continue to be important going forward. And they're going to evolve as the people evolve and where they're working or what they're designed to do. So that's the part that I think is sort of the same overall all the time that I've been in this industry. That's the most important thing. And then how can you measure that impact, or how can you verify that what you're doing is having the positive impact that you want? So I sent a note to somebody just yesterday. It was funny. They've never done any kind of program like this, learning programs. So they're sending me an email like, what do we do? And I'm like, well, they have like some bullet points. Here's the things, that we want them to know. Like literally in this case, it was like 8 pages slide, text only, just text, like 6 of them on each page. Here's the things that they need to do. They're not written as learning objectives. People, they don't have learning backgrounds like we do. They're just like, this is what that we need them to do, And so I look at those and I'm thinking, okay, how about you visualize this and give me some scenarios? Like, and I came up off the fly, like with 3 or 4 different scenarios that they could use that take those topics. And I'm like, go back and think about your this. So I sent him an email last night, and I wasn't sure how it was going to be accepted because it was a bit humorous. You never know how humor is going to work over email, right? So I rewrote this thing. Sam would laugh. I rewrote this thing like 3 times because I'm like, I don't know if I can say that or not. Like, are they going to get the joke? Are they going to take it? So I walked them through the process, but in a very casual wording. It wasn't like, here's a Excel spreadsheet with all the deliverables, right? It was, go outside, have some creative sit tomorrow. Today's going to be beautiful. Go out, sit on your deck, grab these papers, think some creative thoughts, take some notes down, then meet with your other colleagues, share with them. And then when you get something together, share it with the other team. And then when you do that, come back to me. We'll have a conversation. And then if we decide we're going to go forward and build it, we'll maybe hire a firm or someone to build it. Then we'll roll it out. And then then it'll be successful. We'll get some feedback from it. Hopefully this area will be improved. And then we'll meet together and have coffee afterwards and say how great and wonderful we did. And so I just very casual, I guess. But if you could track along with it if you want to do like a little Excel sheet. This is the task he's talking about. This is the task he's talking about. But I just wrote it in like just casual way.
That's a great example of what you earlier said. The language that we speak. Because if you were to speak in your L&D language, maybe it won't really go down so well, and they will not understand.
It wouldn't. They don't understand that language, and they wouldn't. So I sent it off, and then I'm waiting. It was kind of late, so I was making dinner, right? So I'm just kind of hanging out, and I'm waiting for the reply back because I'm thinking, okay, this person's either going to be like, "What the heck, Rick? Who is this guy?" And so I was like, all right, we'll see what they'd say. So they came back and she just said, I love it. This is fantastic,
Wow.
And then the other person on the team who I'd worked with before, who I know has a pretty good sense of humor, she came back immediately and was like, laughing and making all kinds of comments in the email. And so you've got to keep it light and keep it fun, right?
Yeah. I'd love to see that mail if you can remove the details and show it. And I was thinking all this
while
you were
sure, why
this,
not? I'll genericize it.
So next week I'm speaking to Rance Green, who wrote the book on instructional story design, and his book is full of a story that runs through the book about an instructional design person who's trying to convince stakeholders, and there is a little bit of similarity. You may want to go through that book as well. But that's great what you just said. What you are saying is creating engaging, effective learning is still going to remain the same, pre-pandemic or post-pandemic. But what you also added was that for L&D folks to have that initial consulting and guiding conversations with stakeholders to be able to make that possible.
Yeah, and you have to make it into a story, and I mean I took them through it. It's like, okay, you take it, you take these notes and you go out and sit on your deck, have some creative thoughts. I mean, so I made it into like a whole little story for them so they could see the journey that they were going to be taking over the next couple of months if we decide to go ahead and do this program. And so I think people appreciate, a good story in learning and in explaining learning and pretty much any other aspects of it. People we're sort of all born storytellers. And so you can take that and work it into your training wherever. And again, this example I use with them is, they've got these concepts, not written as learning objectives, as concepts. It's like, well, their subject happened to be something that was very easily contextualized. A lot of the topics we try to cover are very conceptual. They're like, and they're really complicated. Some of them are really, really complicated conceptual concepts because you got really intelligent people that are doing, that are dealing with these issues. And so for them, it's like this mind thing. But it just happened. I got lucky with this one that it was something very concrete. And I'm like, compared to the other stuff that we try to help people train others on, this is like easy. It's like you can visually see it happening, And so those are a little bit easier to do. So, but thank you, for bringing us together. This has been fun.
Yeah, I know we've kind of run over the time limit that we had set, but it's been very helpful, very insightful, and very enjoyable. Great stories that you could share from the days that you suddenly shifted to a virtual model and how it is settling down and what you are able to see as feedback and changing preferences of your team managers as well as people. A lot of insights there. Thank you for sharing all of that, Sam and Rick. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all take care.